Alrighty. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest session of the CPD DAXA events. I'm joined this afternoon by Dr. Brad Byra and Dr. Karen Gibbs. We're very excited to indicate the level of attendance that we've received so far this evening or this afternoon. There have been 574 attendees who've signed up for the talk on linking record keeping with billing. Of that, I see the biokineticists coming in at 36, the physios at 99, the psychologists have got a strong following at 169 people, occupational therapy sitting at 68. So clearly the talk that we are going to be listening to this afternoon is something that is of great interest to the members on the call. Right now we're sitting at 195. Just some protocols or housekeeping for the talk as we go through this afternoon. If any of you have got questions for Dr. Byra or Dr. Gibbs, please will you place them in the chat box. I will highlight the chat box now, but I see some of you are already starting to post welcome messages in there. But please will you post your questions, queries for the panelists in there, and then they'll attempt to address them in real time. So we've just hit 205 and growing. Dr. Byra, Dr. Gibbs, let's give it one more minute if you don't mind, and then we will kick off. The attendees are coming in thick and fast. So let's just give those couple of latecomers the opportunity to join in, and then I'll hand over to you. So just yeah, thank you again to everyone for joining us this afternoon.
I think MJ, if I can, while we wait and while people are coming in, and hi to everyone who's from all over the country. I can tell you, balmy, warm, rural KZN sounds great. It is humid here in Cape Town, but I'm told that the weather is coming in fast and it's going to be cool and frosty. So for those of us enjoying our weather, we have four weather systems in one day here, but I know around the country it's cool and hot and steamy, and thunderstorms potentially up in the Gauteng. So just as we do prime ourselves up, half of our preparation as an introduction to everyone who's here up until now, we had a preparation session the other day, and after 90 minutes, we realized we'd run out of topic and we weren't even off question one. So there's a huge amount to talk about, and a lot of that will be made easier by yourselves if you can nudge us into what you'd like to hear. I have lots to say. I know Karen has heaps of experience on her side, and we'll try and align that into a fluid conversation. Of course, MJ, having worked through a lot of this in his own experience, will nod and share. So when we're ready, we can start. But it is nice to get connection from yourselves.
Thank you, Brad. With that said, I think the numbers have slowed down now. We've got 226 participants in the room who are eagerly awaiting the talk from yourself and Karen. So with that said, over to you. I've given you the ability to share your screen as soon as you're ready.
Okay, so we're not going to share screens other than having ourselves on video with you, and I defer to yourselves for the expert guidance. We do recognize those of you that have been on these fireside chats before that Lani is usually guiding us through and acting as chair and anchor. She unfortunately couldn't make it today for personal reasons, so we're just sending a shout out to her and sending her strength. So here's the purpose of today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Brad. I'm new to clinical practice. I started in 1996, so I'm still figuring it out. I've been doing medical legal work in one shape or another since 2004, and really focusing over the last couple of years on the South African medical legal market. And some of that has been the challenges of what should we and shouldn't we do, and how do we work well and where don't we work well. And that led to the issue of third-party payment audits and the issues that went around that. So last month we had a conversation around what happens when there is a request for your clinical records that go with your funder, saying that there's some either billing irregularities or billing discrepancies or billing challenges, and you're asked to explain it. So this is the follow-up to that. But before we jump into this, Corin, maybe just a brief introduction from you to everyone.
Well, firstly, I'm very impressed that I've made the upgrade to doctor. So thank you, MJ. But it's just Corin Gibbs. It's fine, thank you. Yes, I'm a physiotherapist. I've been working with Brad for a while now, and specifically looking at these forensic audits and what the best and the correct way to manage them would be. And I think what we realize is that there's a significant lack of information out there in terms of what the correct routes are to follow when you want to manage one of these effectively. And that's what we're hoping to do here, is to provide you as practitioners with as much information as we can to take some of the fear and some of the mistakes made out of this type of problem.
Absolutely. And so as we go through today, we're talking about your clinical notes, and we're talking about your billing notes, and we're talking about some of the context that needs to go with that. And maybe just by way of introduction to this, I'm going to refer all of us on this call to the health professions guidelines, ethical guidelines, the happy 335-page booklet that gives us some steer and some orientation onto how we should be running our clinical practices. And that's important because when we start looking at or reflecting on some of the challenges we face, and record keeping all by itself is a major challenge, and informed consent all by itself is a major challenge, and disclosure has become an increasing challenge as puppies kicked in, and all of these are important in their own rights. And then how we manage that within our therapeutic environment with billing, and our billing reconciliation is important. So I need to disclose at the outset that we were quite nervous about today's talk, because this is quite an emotive subject. And I said to Corin, I'm actually anxious about coming in here and having this conversation, because behind my screen are now 245 of you who all have questions. And there's probably in your mind, and I know it was in my mind when I first started doing this, the question of, can you be serious? How thorough do my records need to be? How contemporaneous do they need to be in terms of booklet 9? So booklet 9, section 7 is page 7 I'm going to talk about. But the issue of how thorough your notes are is something that I'd like to start with. Then we'll talk about how your notes need to align your clinical notes to your billing notes, and where each of those need to sit. So that's going to be some of the trajectory as we go through today. Corin, is there anything you want to add to that, just so that we can give some orientation?
No, I think if we have to start somewhere, I think a good place would be, and it was when we did our prep for this as well, is to just highlight again why are we doing these clinical notes in the first place? Why are we writing clinical notes? And I think your explanation on that, Brad, was better than mine at the time. So I'm going to throw it.
So why do we write clinical notes? So when I started in practice, the idea of a medico-legal claim, or somebody asking, a personal injury attorney asking for discovery and requesting my notes, was completely foreign. It really wasn't something that happened. And if it did, it happened very seldom. Now, when we start saying to people, well, why do you take clinical notes? Predominantly, they say, well, in case I get sued, you know, if the lawyer wants the notes, then I've got to make sure that the notes are there. Then it became, well, if the funder wants the notes, then I need to have the notes there. And neither of those is the reason that you're taking clinical notes. If we take the architecture down and we take it from the Constitution, and we talk about our inherent rights to life and our inherent rights to dignity and our rights to having bodily integrity here, and the rights to adequate access, or access to adequate healthcare. These are all things that we're expected to have as citizens, as individuals, and in terms of human rights. Also, if you look at the National Health Act, it says we have to behave, we have to be thorough as professionals in what we do. We have to make sure that we provide the user, in other words, the patient and the patient's family and any other person, with the right information at the right time. Equally, there's this thing, and I'm going to lead you towards it, we've spoken about before, but there's a National Patient Rights Charter that was published in the late 90s that we should all be aware of. The patient has the right to be treated by a named practitioner, and they have a right to continuity of care and thoroughness of care. Now, you can't have continuity and thoroughness of care if you're not detailing in your records who you saw, at what time of day, where, and why. You need to be recording that, and in the HPCSA booklets, when it talks about record keeping, it speaks specifically in booklet 9 about what needs to be in your notes. And it says there that your notes are not only your record, but they're the patient's record of their past care, their current care, and they're there for posterity for future care. So that's the purpose of the record. The record is not there to protect you against a funder arguing about whether your billing is appropriate. And they're definitely not there to support the argument that you were not negligent or that you were diligent in your care. They're there for continuity of care for the purpose of the patient. Because if I were to ask you this, what did you have for dinner 18 weeks ago on Tuesday? And what were you wearing? You can't possibly remember that. So you also can't remember what you did with that patient on that day at that time. Which modalities did you use? What approach did you take? What was your diagnostic opinion? And because of that, if the patient comes back, and they often do, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 12 or 15 years later, and they say, listen, I remember that I saw Brad, but I can't remember exactly what he did. And now Karen says to Brad, well, Brad, just tell me what you did with the patient. And I can't remember because I didn't have the notes. Then my obligation to fulfill the continuity of care of my patients is not there. So that's the purpose of record keeping. Now, how long your records need to be and how detailed they need to be is up to you. What nomenclature you use is up to you. So there's multiple disciplines on this discussion today. I'm not suggesting to any of you that you need to use a specific universal code or word or set of language. But you need to recognize that there should be, and this is the recommendation from the HPCSA, there should be a standardized, consistent format for your record keeping. It should be legible. It should be in pen. Remember, this was pre-electronic. If you're going to strike something out, you need to strike it out, but it has to be legible. And then you have to annotate why you struck it out and date and stamp that and not use correction fluid. So the purpose of the record is to protect the patient and ensure that there's continuity of care. Secondary to that is to protect us. Karen, is that consistent with what we chatted about? Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, but that's what we said. That's the theory, and that's the way it should be. But we are in a situation at the moment with these forensic audits where your clinical notes form an integral part at the moment of how you will be able to navigate this audit. So what you've said is the theory, and this is how it's supposed to be. And then what we're seeing in practice is not in line with that. And now I think one of the things we need to also discuss is why is it not in line with that? Is it because of a lack of information? Is it just downright laziness? Or do we just not understand exactly what the purpose of the notes are? Because one physio or one practitioner would argue, yeah, but I can remember what I wore 3 weeks ago on the Monday. You might be able to, but somebody else might not be. But how are you going to prove that that is what you were wearing on that day if there is no clinical notes? So where we're running into trouble with the audits is that we focus so much on the new electronic softwares and the ways how we're going to be making sure we're billing, that to actually sit down and write your clinical notes is something that for most clinicians, it's a pain. You know, we see patients, we are focused on patient care, and at the end of the day, you're tired. and you want to go home, you want to go see your family, and you will do your notes tomorrow. And then tomorrow becomes Thursday, and tomorrow becomes Friday. And I think every practitioner who is on this call, or this webinar this evening, I'd be surprised if there was somebody who would be hand on heart able to say, do you know what, guys, at the end of each day, my notes are just perfect. They're not. I call them Friday afternoon notes, because it just means sometimes it's a Friday afternoon and you want to go home and you don't write clear notes. And it doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you fraudulent, but you must have an understanding and a recognition of the fact that if you were to be subjected to an audit, those Friday afternoon notes are most definitely in a position to come back to haunt you. So I think part of the discussion we need to have here is what happens in an audit when your notes are requested. What happens with these clinical notes, and what are the purpose of these clinical notes in the forensic audit? So, Brad, I don't know if you want to run around with that one for a little bit.
Yeah, I'll run around with anything. Usually it's with chocolate ice cream because that's my preference. But let's break this down into a couple of things. So your notes should include some key foundational content to it. They should include, and in the old days we used to call them SOAP notes, what the patient tells you. In other words, the subjective contribution to what's going on, what in other words, the symptoms. Then there's your clinical impressions, your signs, or your diagnostic opinion. Then there's the assessment of that in terms of what you've put together and where you're going with that. And then there's your plan and your prognosis and what you do, which is actually your intervention. So whether you're doing this contemporaneously and you're writing it in narrative, or you're using codes and nomenclature like LHS, RHS, PV, UQ, doesn't matter what it is. It matters that you have them in that sequence. But then it also matters, and this is something that we often forget. There's a section, and just because it's me and because I'm like this, I'm going to tell you that it's booklet 9, page 7, section 13.7. And what that says, it's actually page 162 of the 335 pages, if you really want to be specific about it. But what it says is your billing notes and your clinical notes need to be kept separately. So if you're using, some people have pre-printed forms, and I don't have a strong view one way or the other, whether you're taking handwritten notes or whether you're typing your notes in. I have a strong view that if you have absent notes, that's less good. But I had a colleague who said to me, they will move me from my handwritten notes when they prise my pen from my cold, dead fingers. I said, well, that's cool. I don't mind. But remember that your notes have to be legible, and because they're going to be read by somebody that's not you, usually somebody like me, if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, it's somebody who's got no medical background or very slight medical background, or who's not still in clinical practice, and who's reading this looking for specific words to align to specific actions. So that's part one of what I wanted to say is, if you were to pause and reflect now, how good are your notes? And they could be sparse, they could be 4 lines. I did and often do a talk where we start talking about the importance of notes, and I use the examples where judgments have happened. Because remember, when we start looking outside of our clinical therapeutic environment, and we move away from colleagues, we're moving away from people, and I see Helen says hi, so podiatry, Helen, hi, back to you. But if it's the podiatrist who's writing the notes, the reasonable podiatrist in the same or similar position would need to be able to interpret those notes. If you're a psychologist, the reasonable psychologist would. Biokineticist, physiotherapist, chiropractor, doesn't matter what your discipline is. The expectation is that the reasonable practitioner with the same or similar training as you, in the same or similar circumstances, can understand your notes and make sense of what you've written. Make sense? So if that's part A, part B would need to be whatever's in your clinical notes, in the treatment component and in the diagnosis component that precedes that. So if I look at you and you say, Brad has the following condition, whatever it is. He's got anxiety with seasonal affective disorder, with a Morton's neuroma and a cervicogenic headache. Let's pick everyone and put one diagnosis for multiple professions. If I've got all of those and that's your diagnosis, then I would expect separately in the billing to have the diagnosis for cervicogenic headache, to have the diagnosis for Morton's neuroma, to have the diagnosis for seasonal affective disorder as 3 separate diagnoses to match in my billing what I have in my clinical notes. Then if I'm doing a specific intervention for whichever one of those, if I'm doing facial release or soft tissue therapy or managing the neuroma with a orthotic device or whatever the case would be, I would then look to see that what's billed and what's coded matches what was in the treatment component of my notes. Now, Corin, you've had a lot of experience in going through some of these issues, and maybe now is a good time to talk about the coding and the NAPI codes and the RPL and what your experience has been, just to create some context.
Yeah, no, and I think that's critical in this regard, because I've gone through many practitioners' notes, and then for one, I don't want to be melodramatic about it, but my heart breaks, because I know I can see that they've actually performed the treatment, but I can also see that they've gotten into a habit of writing the notes in a certain manner, and they've just kept going with this, and it is not sufficient. So if we go to, say, for example, the RPL, when you've got your different disciplines and you've got your different codes, those codes have descriptors, and you've got to be very, very aware of what the descriptor of that code is. And you touched on a very important point just now. Who is going to be evaluating these notes? You cannot assume that the person who's going to be evaluating these notes understands your shorthand. And I can speak from personal experience. I mean, I've created a shorthand which you will not find in any textbook. All right, because it's easier for me, and it's specific to my practice, and it's specific to how I work and the treatment techniques that I use. And never for 1 minute did I consider that, somebody else might not understand that. And as I was going through some of these practitioners' notes, I'd have to contact them and say, what is this? I don't know what this abbreviation is. It's not a normal abbreviation, it's not a common one. And then once they explain it to me, I'll go, oh, okay, that makes sense. But you are lucky that I make the effort of actually contacting you and finding out. I cannot guarantee that that is what's going to happen in an audit. The other thing is that, I'll give you an example. There's a code in physiotherapy that's 702, and it requires, it's an evaluation, and it's very clear in the RPL. It states that, it's a full evaluation, and there must be a documented record of it. And then you look at clinical notes, and there's a physio who will write, a basic SOAP note and just say, evaluation. That's not enough. It's not enough. You need to be very clear in terms of what is the requirement for that code and what that descriptor requires to be matched to your clinical notes. What I've also seen quite a bit is especially in hospital practices, they have a protocol, and then they'll say knee protocol. And that's what it says in the clinical notes. And then they've got all of these billing codes that are associated with it, but nowhere is there a record of what exactly the knee protocol entails. And then when it goes really pear-shaped in the audits, then everybody is up in arms, but there has to be also a recognition of the fact that you cannot expect whoever is looking at your clinical notes to automatically know your knee protocol covers rehabilitation, joint mobilizations, fascial release, whatever. So I think one of the things we need to be very cognizant about is that we've never written clinical notes to survive audits. But the reality is they are being used in audits. So when you do write your clinical notes, you've got to be very, very hypervigilant in terms of what have you billed, and whatever you have billed, are you able to substantiate that in the notes? If you have a descriptor for a code that says neural mobilization, and you go use a colloquial term for it, flossing, whatever, and then it goes badly in an audit, you need to understand why. Be cognizant of who is going to be looking at these notes. Can I justify this? Or do I have a separate protocol in the practice that is documented and very clear about what knee protocol means, so that if a funder comes to me and say, you haven't built these, or you haven't done these codes, and I can say, here's my knee protocol. This has been the practice protocol for the last X number of years, and this is what is included in the knee protocol. It's not the best way to do it, but it is a way to do it. So I think one of the things we need to be very clear about is, if your notes are not strong enough, you're gonna struggle in an audit. The theory we all know, the practical realities of it's a Friday afternoon, you don't want to do that. We all have empathy with it. It makes no difference. If you are not able to substantiate your billing with your clinical notes, then the audit is not going to go your way.
So true story, but I don't want us to limit this discussion to the audit. This is the same kind of thing that can happen if you are asked to give a review because the patient's outcome has been poor. So there was a question that was put forward. I'm not sure protocol-wise if we read out the person's name and said so-and-so asked the question, but the question is, does the HPCSA not recommend that the notes are reviewed with the practitioner so that these strange abbreviations can be explained or could be explained? In the perfect world, when somebody asks you for something, and we're going to come on to Poppy in a little while, but in the perfect world, if I say to you, Corin, please send me your notes as they relate to this. The reasonable expectation would be that it would be, Corin, let's sit together and go through these together so that I can understand what you're talking about. But the last 20 years hasn't shown that to be the case. So as we're going, we can't undo the back of what's happened. So there's a beautiful thing, and I'm talking to the ophthalmologist in 8 days' time. And one of the things, I've got this cartoon that says, the practitioner is talking to the patient, says, well, there's good news and the bad news. Your hindsight is perfect, but your foresight is almost blind. So when we look back and we understand where we come from, in theory, whoever's asking us for information is going to sit with us and go through it and ask the questions and take the time to listen, and we'll be able to explain it to them, and there'll be a great way to match and pair up between what we said we did and what we did and what we built. That's the theory. In practice, it's not always like that. So there's no legislation or regulation that says that anyone who asks you for your notes then has to sit with you and go through it with you so that you can interpret. The regulation says you need to keep notes that are legible, clear, and unambiguous. So if your notes are not legible, clear, and unambiguous, you're actually the one who needs to carry the consequence of that. Now, I'm not saying we should. And I've had many practitioners over the years as we've gone through this who've said, you know what, it takes so long to write notes. If I have to choose between write notes and pay school fees, I'm going to pay school fees. I say, hey, that's your choice. Then a couple of months later, they say, listen, how would it be if I accidentally lost the file? Because I've been asked for this file and the notes are terrible and they're illegible and they're incomplete and I've got billing notes in the corners of them. What would it be like if I just lost this note? And I say worse. Because then the question I'm going to ask is, well, how did you lose the note? Did you lose all the files or only that file? And did you only lose that file because I'm asking for it? Or did you lose that file because your geyser burst and there was a flood and then the cat ran in and tore it to pieces while it was still damp? So when we start asking the question, what does legislation say? Legislation, we would then look at the National Health Act, and we would look at the Health Professions Act or the Allied Health Professions Act, and then we would look at the ethical guidelines of the Health Professions Council or the Allied Health Professions Council. That's what we're expected to meet and exceed, those minimum standards. Then on the other side of it, there's the contractual side that says, if you've got an arrangement with another party, an administrator or a funder, not only then do you have to meet your registration obligations in terms of clear clinical notes, but you also have to meet your agreement with them about what you're going to share in what reasonable time and when. Corin, you're nodding.
No, I'm listening. I'm listening. I'm listening. The sharing of the notes is a very sensitive issue, and it's something that's very controversial. I mean, even in our prep, I think we realized just how sensitive an issue this is. And I think the one thing, there's lots of legislation that we can quote here, but at the end of the day, most practitioners will need to make peace with the fact that the funder has a right to verify or to come to ask you to verify your billing. And to do that, they will want the clinical notes. So at some point, you are going to have to hand over your clinical notes. The question, though, would be, is what do you hand over? And what are your responsibilities when you do hand over these notes? And I know you don't want to make it about the audits, but at the end of the day, when a funder comes to you, they have to be very clear about why they want these notes and what do they want in the notes. And you as a practitioner still has, you have an obligation to your patient to still protect their confidentiality, but at the same time, you need to be very cognizant about what information you can and cannot disclose to the funder. So if you are very clear about what the funder wants, you have an obligation to redact everything from those notes that does not fit with what that remit of that investigation is. And I think I've seen very, very few people do that, actually. Mostly when they are asked for clinical notes, they just blithely hand over whatever is requested. And we have to be very, again, aware of what are you handing over? You still have a responsibility to that patient. You still are bound by your obligations to your statutory body, which is the HPCSA. And you know, I think we need to go back to those booklets. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of them, and there's a lot of information contained in them, and we have to go and read them. I mean, I don't quote the booklets as well as Brad does, but you know, in booklet 5, they're very clear that if you are making information available to a funder for purposes of an audit, only the information that is relevant to the purpose of the disclosure needs to be revealed. You can't just go and hand over whatever you want. You have a responsibility. But then at the same time, you know, we are in a situation here where we have to accept that the funder has a right. They have a right to match those. You have a responsibility to make sure that whatever clinical notes you write, if you do get into a position where you have to have somebody evaluate that, and again, it needs to be in such a manner that a reasonable person will be able to match what you've billed with what you've written in your clinical notes.
Yeah, so thanks, Corin. A quick question to Leslie. Did we answer your question? Because usually if you were in the audience, I could see you'd be nodding or you'd be shaking your head or shrugging your shoulders. So hopefully that question specifically was answered. The challenge that we have as we go through this is we need to recognize a couple of home truths. One of them is, what if the funders say they've already gotten consent from the patient, their member? Do you redact your notes then? So I don't know who the anonymous attendee is, but thanks for the question. Now let's get into the issue of disclosure. So disclosure, we back in Tiger country, and back in Tiger country means we're talking about ethical guidelines books 4, 5, and 9. So disclosure says if you are going to be disclosing information about a patient, and we'll come to Poppy because Poppy plays a role here as well. In order to disclose information about a patient to a third party that's not the patient, you need written consent from that patient. Simple as that. If the patient gives consent to that third party on their document, and that then is forwarded to you, and it says unequivocally, I, patient, give permission that you, therapist, provide my clinical notes to third party A, then there's no problem. But unless you've got a written express consent to release your the clinical notes about me as the patient, you can't do that. Nowadays, under Poppy, it's a little bit stronger than that, is that the notes can only be used, or the information that's personal can only be used for the purpose that it was collected. So if you're collecting clinical information, your consent form needs to say that this, and most of yours already do, that this information that's being collected is going to be used and shared as appropriately with funders on their request, and I need your consent to release information to the funder. So pause for a second as I say this, because what do you already share with the funder as part of the general contract that you have between yourself and your patient? You've got your patient to sign consent that their information relating to their billing will be shared with a third-party administrator and funder. Agreed? And hopefully now you're nodding, because if you're contracted in or you're being paid by a funder on behalf of a scheme, guess what? You've got that agreement. That agreement is already in place. The second thing is to say, well, what is it that you're sharing? And this becomes a little bit more important. So what you're sharing is this. You're sharing the information that relates to your diagnosis, because that's your ICD code, right? Then you're sharing the information that relates to the procedures that you did. That's what you need to share. So if you've got one procedure and 2 treatments, or 3 treatments and 4 modalities, however you're doing your billing, each of those is coded to match the diagnosis. So your procedure codes and your diagnosis codes related to the RPL and related to your NAPI codes all have to link together. That's the component of the clinical note that you are required to show to justify in the event that that's what's required of you. You're not required to share, and I as a patient would be aggrieved if I come in and I see Corin and I say, you know what, Corin, I'm having a real crisis. I've got these relationship issues, and I've got issues around my sexuality, and I've got issues of stress at work, and consequently I tripped over the cat, and that's what's caused my condition as to where I am now. None of that is what I'm comfortable to share with a third party. I'm comfortable that you share your diagnosis and my treatment with a third party. But my disclosures to you about my condition are private to me, and you would need specific consent to be able to share that. Corin, your thoughts?
No, I agree, and I think that's a critical one. We need to be very much aware of what we write in the notes, and then we also need to be aware, and just in general, that's not relating to audits. The patient has a right to see their own notes. So when you write clinical notes, you've got to be very careful what you write. At any point, that patient can come and request those notes. So I've also seen in the clinical notes that some practitioners write, and I see information and then my eyebrows lift and I go, wow, if the patient were to ever request these notes, I'm not so sure they would be happy with the manner in which you have described them, if I can put it that way. You must remember that your clinical notes are supposed to be a professional record, which can be accessed. You having an opinion about the patient's emotional state or truthfulness or anything along those lines, you've got to be very careful what you write in those clinical notes, because again, at some point, the patient has the right to access that. But when we come back to the point of how detailed these notes would be, at this point in time, and in the situation where we are now with forensic audits, I actually would suggest you can't be too detailed. You can't be too detailed. I even advise the physiotherapists to put timestamps on. You know, how long was your treatment? What time did the patient come in? What time did the patient leave? There are some codes for some of the disciplines that are time sensitive, and you know, if you get to a point where it is reflected in your notes that you spent X amount of time with the patient, then the time-sensitive codes are much more easily justified. And I think it's one of those things where be aware, and I'm going to come back to it every single time, be aware what the descriptors are of the different codes. If you use a nomenclature that doesn't fit with that, you either have to be very clear that you have a separate document that explains your abbreviations, or you need to be willing to go in and explain your abbreviations to a funder. And that's one way of doing it. If I can give anybody advice, you really don't want to go into a meeting with a funder if you don't have to. These are not pleasant. So just make it as easy as possible for yourself. If you know what the descriptor are and you've performed that code and you've performed that treatment, make sure that the note just matches it. If you've used a specific ICD-10 code, and this is something actually I have to say I see quite often, as we as practitioners start to get used to certain ICD-10 codes, and we don't bother to be super correct on the ICD-10 code. We're sort of generally in the direct or in the vicinity of correctness. And then especially when you're looking at situations where for some professions you bill with 2 conditions and you need to justify 2 conditions, the funders sometimes look at these and say that they are sequelae, so the 2 conditions are not necessarily separate. They follow on from each other, or they are related. And if your clinical notes in that regard are not clear, then you are running into trouble. You cannot create and treat a second condition when there's no record in your notes of actually having evaluated and identified and made a diagnosis on a second condition. I don't know how many of the professions are subject to this, but I know the physios are definitely. So again, if you're going to be treating 2 conditions, you need to be very clear that you have documented 2 conditions, that your ICD-10 codes are as correct as possible. If you use a spinal code, a spinal treatment code, but your ICD-10 code is for a peripheral joint problem, again, you are just creating unnecessary drama for yourself down the line. But as frustrating as it is, and we all want an easy answer to this, there isn't. The notes are simply not good enough at the moment. And I can say that from the ones that I've seen. The vast majority are not good enough. And we need to call a spade in this regard. There's no point we try and be polite about it. I'm not saying that you haven't done what you say you've done. The majority of us as practitioners are not fraudsters, but the reality is we have a statutory obligation to keep accurate records. And at the moment in practice, very few of us do, unfortunately.
Agreed. And so just some comments, Karen, thank you for that. Some comments that have come up through this. And just to close off the comment from our anonymous attendee earlier, what if the funders say they've already got consent? They need to share that consent with you, number 1. And number 2, you need to send them only the information that is relevant to what they're asking for. So the patient's presenting complaint or your impressions of them professionally are not relevant to what they're asking. They're asking you for your diagnosis and your treatment and its alignment to the billing code. If that's what they're asking you for, then that's what you need to share. And there's a difference between whether they're challenging you in terms of whether you are diagnostically appropriate. That's not what these conversations are about. So I think that's number 1. Number 2, there's a comment, and I appreciate it. As a rule, I inform all patients that they're free to request their notes at any time. We need to understand that patients have the rights to access their clinical notes at any time at all. And it is not for us to act as a barrier. When a patient requests their notes, we're obligated to give them those notes or a report or a copy within a reasonable amount of time without creating a barrier to their access to their information. What they then do with that is entirely up to them. So we need to be aware that our obligations is that we are custodians of the notes, but the notes don't belong to us. The notes belong to the patient. The investigations belong to the patient. And so at any time the patient, or in the case where the patient is a minor, the minor with the consent of the patient. So the minor with the consent of the parent can in writing request the notes. So again, when we go back to the beginnings of what we were saying here, the notes are there for the patient for continuity of care. How those notes are used by third parties is largely outside of our control. We just need to make sure that we're doing it right. So Leslie asked a question, and Karen, maybe you want to answer this. If the medical aid then asks about a 702 code, and we have to document everything, all of these things would come up. How do we then keep it confidential?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think that's an excellent question. Well, I think you've got to be, what does the funder want to see? They want to see that you have actually done an evaluation. I think you can redact quite a bit from that and still make it very clear that you've done an evaluation. The objective, if it's subjective, the subjective part of the evaluation, you most definitely can redact from that. But a full evaluation will include your objective and your note-taking on your objective and your goal setting and your plan for the patient, which all forms part. We all know that's what forms part of an evaluation, a proper detailed evaluation. Then that has to be there, and that'll be clear. I've seen where funders have looked at this and where, again, some sensitive information has been redacted and it hasn't been a problem. Don't go and redact the entire evaluation. You know, the patient's range of motion at his ankle is now really not sensitive information that he might not want to share with a funder. So, you know, I know we always say common sense is not a flower that grows in everybody's garden, but a little bit of common sense goes a long way with this. If you were to read that, I think the question I always ask myself is, if it were me, if I were this patient, would I be comfortable with this aspect being disclosed to them? Yes, no. And then again, what is my obligation to disclose this? Is it relevant? I'm coming back to that clause in booklet 5. Is it relevant? Is the patient's mental state at that time relevant to the purpose of the audit, is trying to check if you've done half an hour of rehabilitation? No, it's not. Redacted. Redacted. You don't need to include that, and you can still protect the patient's confidentiality in that regard and still provide the funder with the evidence they require that the claim can be verified. I don't know, Brad, would you agree with that?
In part I would, but in part, and apologies that my camera was off. I've had the most amazing technology day. We're in a presentation this morning, my whole screen went black. And we live in a world, and I'm going to digress slightly and come back to a question that was asked about notes being illegible. There was a time that I can fondly remember that if I wanted to see a patient, they arrived physically at the rooms. Or I went to their house, or we were on the side of a sports field, or we spoke on the telephone. Now you've got mobile telepathy, you've got 6 or 7 different platforms that you can digitally speak on, and then there's Zoom, and there's Teams, and there's Blue Jeans, and 10 or 12 different other kind of platforms. So now the question is, are you taking notes? Are you recording this? Because your patient can record you, but you need permission to record them. And it brings the question of our conduct in terms of how we interact with our patients and what is meaningful. Now, nowadays, we have such good access to our patients. For example, for me, when a patient signs their patient contract with me, I say to them, I will be communicating with you using WhatsApp. And I'm using this as preamble because now, if I've got a request to release clinical information as it relates to my treatment of Corin, what's the first thing I should do? I should reach out and say to Corin, hey, Corin, I've had a request. Are you aware of this request? Are you comfortable with me sharing this information? And if so, I need your consent to release this information in full. Corin, as the patient, can come back and say, whoa, hang on a second. I didn't consent to this. I don't agree to this. In which case, you've got a very clear position as to how to move forward. So one of the things that I want to say as we move, and we see this a lot on the medico-legal side and sometimes on the funding side, there's nothing wrong with pausing and saying, hey, information needs to be shared. Let me just reach out and get consent from the patient or patients, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100, however many there are, so that you can make sure that in terms of POPI and in terms of your disclosure obligations under booklet 5 and in terms of your professional registration, that you're doing this the right way. And I think that's important. And I think when you're not sure, ask. Now, everyone has a indemnifier or a professional colleague or a membership where they can reach out and they can say, hey, I've got this request, what should I do? And I probably take 10 or 15 calls a day in my own capacity, and I know Corin takes a lot in her current capacity, and I know ProfNet takes a lot daily in their capacity, asking these questions. So there's a question here that says, if the notes were illegible, can you write a report? I'm saying you may want to suggest that you write a report, but if people ask for the source documents to make sure that what you're saying and what's true, you need to make sure that the two match each other. And I say that because I've had cases where we've requested notes and got a report. And I've read the report, and so has the other person. And they said, no, this report looks really sketchy. And they've insisted and compelled the practitioner to give their notes, and their notes and the reports didn't match. So if you're going to write a report, make sure that your report and your notes match. Because if you are called to come in and they say your notes are illegible, you say, yes, they are. Then they say, well, how did you write the report? So you've got to be careful. Your notes are legible or they're not. If they're not legible, now's where you draw a line and insist in your own mind that everything going forward has legibility to it, so that you don't get into that. If you did a summary of your complex evaluation with a diagnosis and treatment plan, that may or may not be sufficient, because what they're asking for is for you to demonstrate that what you did clinically in your rooms, and whatever your discipline is, and what you build for match. And sadly, I've been on the other side of some of these forensic journeys, not only here, but around the world, where people have said, I did this, and then they've billed for 70 Rand for gloves, and 4 sets of gloves, and for face paper, and for oil, and for dry needles. And sometimes they've billed 5 different patients for the drive to the hospital, but they only drove to the hospital once, but they charged each patient the drive time to the hospital. And of course, these are some of the reasons why sometimes people get asked and challenged for their things. So understand that what you do is measured in what you record. There's a very sensitive case that was finally reported in the courts last year. And one of the experts for the patient who was harmed went on and said, if it's not in your records, it didn't happen. So aside from whether you're doing this for a forensic or a waste audit, or you're doing it for a medico-legal issue, or you're doing this because you want to be thorough, understand that your contract obligation is with your patients to be thorough. That's your first and foremost reason for your record keeping. So there's a question here that says, in the case of hospital treatments, would it be allowed to document that the patient has done all the prescribed exercises as per the pamphlet that was given preoperatively? That would be fine, but I wouldn't pay you to document that. Well, then what were you doing there? How long did you spend with that? You just find it too cumbersome to document all the exercises that the patient did. Well, maybe what you need to do is have an insert that you tick, that's in your patient records, that ticks the exercises that were done. But then, notwithstanding that, you have to say that you were there. How long were you with that patient? Did you just call them up and say you did your exercises and the patient said yes? Or were you physically in the ward? Did you take that post-operative patient who's had a hip replacement and show them how to use the crutches, or did you give them the pamphlet? Did you show them how to do standing hip flexion and external rotation, or did you take their word for it? And that's generally where some of these questions comes in, is did you actually spend the time to do what you say you did that you're billing for? So these are important things. I see that, Paula, you've raised your hand. Is it possible for you to put your question into one of the chat boxes? So, Corin, how are we doing?
I just want to follow on from something you said there.
Please do.
One thing that practitioners need to be very aware of is that the funder has no problem phoning a patient. So you also have to be very specific, and you've got to be careful about this. If you are going to be billing for a treatment where you say that you did loads of exercises with the patient and you actually just walk in and gave them a pamphlet, you've got to consider the possibility that that funder might at some point phone a patient and ask, listen, were these performed? Did this happen? The patient goes, no. The practitioner walked in, put the pamphlet down and walked out. And that's a problem. You've got to be cognizant of it. So if you lie in your clinical notes, you will get away with it for a while, but at some point it will catch up with you. And I've seen that, and the outcome is not good. And technically, the funder is one part of your worry in that regard. The HPCSA is a much bigger concern if something like that were to happen. So you've got to be specific. Don't just write notes the way, just to do it the quickest, easier way. I personally hate the acronym, or the ISQ, Brad, I think in status quo. Maybe we'll just go as the same as the previous day. And what did I do? No, I did the same as yesterday. I don't think that's good clinical practice to start with, but it's also, once you get into that habit of, I'm just going to write what's the quickest and the easiest. And if a patient then comes and says something different to a funder, you literally have nothing to fall back on. You have nothing to fall. You don't have comprehensive notes to disprove them. And then you start to run into trouble.
Right, and agreed. So sometimes when I share some of my background, I feel like I'm 460. But part of one of my roles, which was really good, that I enjoyed, was I was risk manager for an orthopedic hospital, and they were migrating at that stage from paper records to electronic records. So the question that was raised by one of the anonymous attendees was, do records need to be pen and paper, or do they have to be electronic? They can be handwritten in ink, or they can be typed on a PC. You can use an electronic medical record, and there's many of them around, like the EZMed system that ProfMed is very close to. You can use whatever you want, as long as your records conform with the minimum requirements that are laid out under section booklet 9 of the ethical guidelines. There's others, but I go back to the ethical guidelines booklet because you can download that today and you can look at it today and it's clear. It's not clear as mud, it's clear. It tells you in 12 bullet points what needs to be in your records. That's what needs to be in your records. And it's not my opinion or Corin's opinion or the funder's opinion. It's got to do with the fact that there are some basics that we signed up to commit to when we started in clinical practice. And what we started with in clinical practice was we said we would be diligent. We would first do no harm. Diligent means we would do what is required under the prescriptions of what protects our profession. So there's a lot of people who get really mad when somebody who is not a registered practitioner purports to do the services of a registered practitioner and then bills and asks for the credentials. We say, well, they can't do it. They didn't have our education. They didn't have our training. They don't have our rules and regulations. Very true, they don't. But equally, if we have our rules and regulations, we need to, at the very least, adopt them, embrace them, and work with them as best we can. So we're coming to the end of today's conversation. Paula, maybe this would be a good time for you to share the question, which, or maybe it happened by accident, because I know sometimes these Zoom things with raise your hand can be quite sneaky. Corin, do you want to close out with a short summary as we wind down, and then I'll answer Jonathan's question?
How blunt can I be? So proper, short,
You've got
blunt
271 friends here, so it's up to you.
Yeah, I think the reality is, guys, we're just not doing. We're just not. It's not good enough at the moment. Okay, we can complain about it, and we can give all sorts of excuses as to how the patient, and we'd rather treat than sit and get bogged down in admin. But the reality of it is, in my experience that I've seen in the last year, it's simply not good enough. We need to up our game when it comes to these clinical notes, and not just for clinical audits. Like Brad said, what's critical is that we have a statutory obligation to do this. And I think I forgot that until we had the prep session. I forgot that was actually the reason why we wrote them in the first place. But be cognizant of the fact when you write these notes, people might be looking at them, the patient might be looking at them, how detailed they need to be. You don't have to write a medico-legal report every single time. I see somebody in the chat mentioned it. No, that's now pulling the dam out from under the duck. Make sure that whatever you bill, you are able to substantiate in your clinical notes. Understand your descriptors. Make sure that whatever the descriptor of the code you bill, you are either able to note that in your clinical notes, or that the language you use is easily traceable back to that descriptor of the code that you use to bill. If you're going to use shorthand, make sure you have something there that explains the shorthand to whoever has to read your clinical notes. And I think at the end of the day, we've got to just be aware of the fact that there is no shortcut with this. As much as we would love there to be, there simply isn't a shortcut for this particular matter.
Great. So thank you, Corin. I've got two questions that I really want to answer. The first one was from Joanne. I'm sorry if I got it wrong. Absolutely. If you can tick off that you've done the exercises with the people. You don't have to write in full hand that you've done all the exercises. If you've got exercise sheet code 4113 knee, then you have an attachment of that and you can tick those exercises. You don't have to rewrite them in your notes, but you do need to reference them. There was a comment of what you should do if you're treating a minor without consent. You can't treat a minor without parent consent. If you're seeing a minor without consent, you've got some very significant National Health Act Section 6 and 7 issues. So why would you be seeing a minor without parent consent? Only if there's a critical injury, if there's imminent harm to that minor, where clinical intervention of one form is life-saving or life-preserving, or that there is no one around to give consent. And then the administrator from the hospital needs to give consent, or ultimately the ultimate guardian of the minor, which is the judge in the High Court. So please be very careful when you're working with minors, and be aware that consent is precedent. If you are treating a minor without consent, there's some significant issues. But I see we're at the end of our time. I want to say thank you very, very much. I hope this was informative for you. I see some messages coming through. If you have consent and the parent is not present at the session, that's no problem. As long as there's consent for you to work with that child. And if you are working with minors, you should very much try and have at least a chaperone or another person present, so that you're not in the room alone with a minor. MJ, thank you very much. To everyone who was in the audience, and to ProfNet, thank you very much for today's session. Karen, of course, thanks to you.
Thank you, Brad and Karen, for a most informative talk. I think that the chat box is definitely testament to the fact that everyone has thoroughly enjoyed the talk. Also, the numbers have continued to climb. Brad, as you know, in some of our other talks, we've seen sometimes where those numbers decrease. They've only been increasing, which again is testament to something and a talk that's been incredibly interesting and very, very topical at this stage. Thanks again to ProfNet and EZMed, or the Ducks Academy of Healthcare, for the opportunity for Genoa to be involved in the talk. Thank you to all of the attendees, and we hope that you found the talk to be of a level that I'm sure to find the talk sorry, I'm losing my words here, but I hope that you all enjoyed the talk as much as I did. So with that said, thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your evenings. Brad, I'll see you on the next talk in a few hours. So we've got a busy slate. Ciao, everyone.